Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode of the Doctor's Lab with my esteemed co-host, Dr. Khalid, Brother Khalid Green, myself, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker, Brother Abdul Haqq Baker. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Khalid. How are you?
Wa alaikum salam, rahmatullahi barakatuh. Hoping I'm not looking like I'm behind the prison walls broadcasting. And if I was, I would interview some inmates to see how they're being treated. But alhamdulillah, Allah yubarak fikum. It's a pleasure to be back on the doctor's lab, and hopefully we can dissect some issues here, inshallah ta'ala.
Well, mashallah, tabarakallah, it's quite appropriate that you've got that background, because if you've escaped or you're inside prison, which I know you're not, it brings us onto the topic very aptly regarding an individual called Daniel Khalif, who there was a huge news that's across the media, an escaped terrorist convicted of terrorism, used to be in the military, and there was a 4-day hunt for him. And I think it was the audacity of the escape that grabbed everyone's attention and really raised doubts and questions around the security of prison services. Now, he escaped from Wandsworth prison, which is in my old area where I used to live and everything, just down the road from there in Tooting. And he'd basically climbed and positioned himself under a lorry, I think a laundry lorry or whatever, and made his escape that way. He was found, and there were sightings of him, and everyone was looking for him to bring him back in. But even the authorities said, the police said, he was not a high-profile case as it related to danger. The public shouldn't be scared if they saw him. And I think the reason why we're looking at this today is because, as we've discussed previously, Khalid, we want to refocus on aspects of extremism, okay, and what that looks like, the nature of it. Has it shifted? Where, if so, has it shifted toward? And I'm quite interested in looking at the knee-jerk and almost sheeple perspective that we have as the populations that follow whatever the media throws out in front of us, as if when there isn't media coverage of something, it doesn't exist. And then immediately upon it becoming to the center of attention, we're now focusing and discussing elements of extremism, security, and the like. Also, alongside that arbitrary nature, that subjective nature of the news and how we respond to it collectively as societies, is that we see that insidious strategy of some societies, France in particular, in that continued effort and drive to marginalize, criminalize Muslim practice and attire, especially that focus upon women. So we knew before, many years ago, well, not so long ago actually, there was the ban on the niqab.
Right.
Now they're moving towards banning the abaya. And the question can be asked on that, Khalid. While I've looked at that as, from the French perspective, behavioral extremism, and I explained what that was previously, and I'll reiterate what that is now. Behavioral extremism being subjective and dependent on through whose lens you are looking. So France has now added the abaya as an extremist symbol, okay? A behavioral extremist symbol. In the UK, it hasn't happened like that. It hasn't happened in the US. It's not like that in most of the Muslim world as well. So again, that's why I bring the subjectivity issue around it, and that it shouldn't be a cause for concern like we're seeing with France. So I see that as well as an extremism from a liberal perspective in objectification of the Muslim woman, the Muslim woman's body. Some will say the covering is objectification. No, that we know that the covering is a veiling, is a protective ornament. I'd say ornament, the garment's not an ornament. How can I say, as attire, a protective attire for the Muslim woman. So the objectification is coming from a Western perspective. And I think this is problematic. And it is necessary that we discuss this, because there's almost an acceptance or a subjugation that we are now becoming numb to with regards to rights that are being infringed upon as it relates to Muslims, and it's always targeting the woman, the Muslim woman first and foremost,
and the children. We can't forget the
followed by
children.
the children. Yes, by the
Women
again
and children. That's the
the
easiest way
curriculum.
to get in there. Yeah.
That's right.
So, yeah, I see this as a, I concur with what you say, what you said, and also, this is just kind of the logical negative extension of secularism and that secular onslaught. So I have a few things I want to highlight real quick from my PhD, which exactly was talking about France as the case study. So I said, aside from pluralism, another challenge posed by Western democracies for Muslim minorities is secularism. Western democracies differ with regard to their policies towards religion, tolerance, and multiculturalism. One example of a Western democratic country that enforces an aggressive policy of assimilation is France. Assimilation is a key pillar of French democracy and political culture, as well as a part of its colonial legacy. So, I go into these are things that you're definitely aware of, but maybe for our audience. And I have a quote from Roy, and I can't remember which book and I'm sure you probably have the book in your collection as well. He says, outside France, this very offensive and militant liacité, I don't know how to say that in French, is perceived as excessive and even undemocratic since it violates individual freedom. So basically saying that, hey, France's policy with the hijab and stuff somewhat is viewed negatively by other governments. But what's interesting is even some of the researchers, and this is stuff going back to 2007, which is now what, however many years ago, practically 20 years ago, 16 years ago, whatever, saying that, Western democracies were kind of looking and seeing that this multiculturalism is kind of failing in their as a policy, and are kind of reanalyzing the French model. And we see it in little bits and pieces. We have, for example, America's so big, we have those who are so Islamophobic that they do want to see these kind of they don't have a problem with this kind of these policies and assimilation. And you have people on the streets even, and I've been talking to a lot of Somalis recently, saying, hey, our children, they don't want to speak Somali because they're bullied, they're ostracized because of this. And there's those pressures, and then there's a gap because there's a lot of elders that don't even speak English, and that's a whole nother topic there. But they can't communicate with their children because the children don't want to speak their native tongue because they're,
Right.
attacked in the schools, outside the schools. People are threatening them, hey, speak English. But so my point is that there is pockets of this all over in a country like America. You have those who do want, like push for a hardcore assimilation. No, you should not wear hijab. No, you should not do this.
Mm.
And they see it as a symbol of repression and so forth. France is just very aggressive, and that's the whole government, and it's really their political culture because assimilation, this was a part of their colonial legacy when they
Right.
came. Look at the
Right.
French, Algeria, Morocco, all the francophone, whatever you would call them, francophile
Yeah.
African countries that are were a product of that, the imprint. And what we see going on now in Mali and this, and France doesn't want to leave. They're saying, hey, get the hell out of our country, we don't want you anymore. No. And Macron and those guys said, no, we're not. Because the reality is, it's not just supposed this terrorist threat that they want to quail in those countries, but we
Right.
know France benefits tremendously, Europe especially, probably America as well, from their colonial past, and they get massive amounts of resources. And perhaps from my readings, France would probably fall if they were to totally divorce themselves from those former French colonies, if they were no longer to pay annually the millions and millions, perhaps billions of dollars from their resources to French to support France. And so they're essentially raping them outside of the after this neocolonialism, and they can't do without it. So it's just it brings up a lot of issues, and it's very interesting. I'll just end on this without going off on too many tangents and so forth. But what I look at some of these things on a scale of, as Malcolm said, something like, well, the chicken's coming home to roost. So a lot of the problems we see in the Western countries now, and this goes from, dealing with Muslim and non-Muslim countries, is the legacy of their colonial past and so forth. They're dealing with now these new generations of their colonial subjects and so forth, and the problems of not being welcoming to them. And just like in America, the past and the legacy of slavery and all those things. Well, now you're dealing with the fallout as a society, the crime, the destruction of the family, and the lack of social cohesion, and all the other problems. It's the chicken coming home to roost. And then people say, well, why is this? Go back to your country. Go back to Africa. Get out of the country. There's so many things going on there. And sorry to kind of go off on many tangents, because so many things just flooded my head with regards to some of these topics. But
no,
yeah,
that's important. I think
yeah.
no, it's important to highlight that from your studies, Khalid. And I was looking at some of my studies as well, as you were discussing, and from that Francophile agenda, it dovetails neatly into where I think we need to discuss things. So what we're seeing as kickback, the chickens coming home to roost in France, we've only seen what's happened recently on the African continent with Niger, okay?
Yeah.
Where we've seen the military coup take place. And this has worried and shaken a lot of individuals, and they're very fixed on that. But what have they done economically as well? The coup, the new leaders, as they are, increased the price of uranium, which the West are dependent on, and they increased it from 80 cents per kilogram to the recommended price that it's been sold for across Europe of 200 euros per kg.
Wow. Oh, no
So
wonder they're
France
upset.
were exploiting, like they've done with other African Francophile countries, and let's not forget what the UK and others have done with the Anglophile African countries that they colonized. That exploitation of minerals, mineral resources, and such like, it's no surprise that you are getting kickback from those societies. And I'm not justifying this, what I'm about to say now, from a terroristic perspective, with the rise in terrorism there, where ISIS have now gravitated towards the African continent as opposed to the Middle East. And you're seeing at a political level this taking place. And Khalid, I want to bring this now. We're going to talk about frameworks as we do, because it's important for the participants. And if I haven't said it, I think I did. Wa alaikum salam to those of you who've joined us. It's important to understand that governments have playbooks, okay? They have playbooks, they have strategies. When the CIA go into topple a society, a regime, there's a strategy, there's a playbook that's there. There's so many things with regards to germ warfare, with regards to vaccines and the like. There are strategies that are there, that are deployed upon the masses. So, for example, R.D. Krelestein, and I like using his frameworks, and I cite them in some of the works when I'm doing workshops internationally and so forth. But he provides a framework where you have horizontal parallels, and on either side of those parallels, there are competing forces. On the top of that horizontal parallel framework, you have the state, the government, the authorities, statutory bodies, agencies. Beneath that parallel framework, you have society, civic society. So I want to bear with me for a moment, because I want the viewers to visualize this as well. So at the top, you have policy, politics being implemented top down from the government. And usually, because what is happening there, there's social control, law-abiding citizens. They go with the status quo, who they've voted for, even those who have voted against. but they comply because of the democratic process. So you have a social control mechanism strategy that is there. But when there is disagreement with those politics, with those policies, like we saw in France recently and previously with the yellow vests, when the electricity prices went up, the petrol, the oil prices went up, they went out and protested. So in contrast to those policies and the politics of the day, if there's resistance, you have protest. Now, Khalid, that's the first push and pull that takes place. Politics and policies from the top, disagreement with some of those policies, and a pushback, which is lawful at that stage from the bottom. Civic society, protests, marches taking place. We're talking about society now, not Muslims. It then decides who moves to the next stage, who moves along that horizontal framework, political, socio-political framework. Do the authorities start looking for intel and infiltrating those protesters? That's happened. We've seen many cases of that happening in the UK. I'm sure it's happened in the US.
Of course.
And so those protesters who realize that they are being infiltrated, being subverted, they go into a stage of subversion. Not all the protesters, a tiny element become more radical because they see security intel coming upon them. They move into submersion. So now you're moving from social control, law-abiding citizens, you're moving to an element of deviance from the civic society elements that have gone into subversion. And I'm going to conclude what I'm saying. I just want to keep this visualization there. So they've moved from politics, from the top, protest at the bottom. There's dissent that's taken place now from civic society. Then it moves to crime. And at the top, from the top horizontal, they start employing and deploying criminal justice. Let's go to America, for example, 6th of January. Okay, it went into subversion. It went into dissent. What are the American government and apparatus using now? Criminal justice to prosecute these individuals. Then it moves to another stage now, Khalid. And that's within our immediate societal stage, but I'm saying that it can go wider to like what we're seeing in Niger and the colonization. So it moves from that security intel, that subversion, to state terrorism from above, but they don't call it that. Okay, state terrorism. And from the bottom, which they're quick to label, those who've moved from subversion to more extreme means, more drastic measures, looked at as insurgent terrorism from below. So you've moved along from social control to internal war and revolution. Now that's within, and we saw, let's go back to 6th of January. That played out. And you had a very powerful individual inciting civic society to do that on his behalf, Donald Trump. Yes, from peaceful politics protest right across to subversion. What are those boys? The something boys. The Proud Boys. Yeah. From moving towards crime and insurgent terrorism, trying to take over Capitol Hill on that particular day. Okay, that's from beneath. But we often see, when you look at other governments and America, when they're going into other societies, state legislated terrorism from above. That includes, in my estimation, what what France has done to the Francophile countries, in the way they've subverted them, the way they've subdued them. And we see this financial stricture placed around some of those economies in their raw materials. And we see that taking place in the Americas, what's happened in the South American countries with the CIA and what they've done to topple governments in the past. So we have to look at that. But notice how that language, that vernacular, the vocabulary of state terrorism doesn't reach the lips of anyone, even amongst civic society today, as almost as though these words are taboo words. We need to start calling these things what they are, because state legislated terrorism has long tentacles. Long tentacles. What we see with what happened in Iraq, the initial Iraq war, and then the 2003 invasion into Iraq. Again, because there were mineral resources that were there that could be exploited. But then they focus, again, coming back, France as an example, on diminishing and weakening Islam, the Muslims, by targeting women and children, while they're fighting that overarching strategic battle, state legislated terrorism, under the guise of winning hearts and minds in foreign lands. And as you said, they wonder why so many refugees are flooding into European shores. I'll stop there. I've said a lot.
Allah you barak. Now, well, I guess now we probably need to move back into the crux of our topic here and get back on. We've given some lessons in colonialism and so forth. Although there's definitely the relationship there and the state terrorism and so forth. So what about this Abaya ban in France? So again, we see this imposition of French secular policy being, that's their political culture. That's how they run their so-called democracy. And we see that it has those elements, that forcing of the state power to influence people's mores and their norms and their culture, because they want a unified culture. And that's quite problematic for the Muslims, obviously, that our Muslim identity and religious identities in general, for Muslims is not just in the private sphere, but it's in the public sphere. Muslims would practice Islam in all realms, and that's intrinsic. If we look at the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we'll see that the Shar, the Sharia, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen and his legislation, it can't be subverted. It can't be compromised. We cannot elect it out of, and elect a new way of ruling and a new source and a new means and new mores and new norms. And this is also some of the issues we find as Muslim minorities with dealing with some of the things that are forced upon us. For example, we've talked about this before, the LGBTQ ideology, that it's an onslaught. It's not just something like, okay, hey, some rights, or let's just be tolerant of one another. No, it's pushed in your face. It's on the commercials now. You can't look at an insurance commercial without two men riding on a bicycle, and just crazy stuff. It's in the meetings, it's in the institutions, and they so the bottom line is we are being pushed, and we are being poked, and we are being ostracized. And these are direct assaults on the religion, especially in a place like France. So for French Muslims, and even though there's such a large body, but that question is they will have to ask themselves eventually, hey, is it time to really consider hijrah or not? I mean, they really are in a, France, and then some of those other Norwegian states that, I think Belgium and some other places that have very strong policies against hijab,
But let me ask,
go ahead.
let me ask, I want to throw in something into the mix which hasn't been discussed before, and I'm not sure if it's been discussed in other forums, and especially hasn't been discussed from the I think, orthodox perspective that you and I speak from. Is there a middle way or an alternative way with regards to how we present ourselves as Muslims in the West? Now, bear with me on this, Khalid. I was speaking to a brother today, mashallah, Salafi brother, really established in what he's doing, mashallah. But it was something that I was looking at a few weeks ago. We have many sisters, there's freedom of expression and everything, and we see that it doesn't extend to us when we want to dress or behave a particular way, that is still conducive with the environment that we're living in. But I've questioned, since living abroad all the years and coming back, and I changed my perspective when I saw how actualized the living of Muslims were in those Muslim lands compared to those of us, especially converts, who were living abstract understandings of the deen, in contrast to the actualized understanding that they had there. So my question is this: with that ban and things and the pressure that's happening with our identity, our apparent identity, and the criminalization of aspects of our attire, wearing the black abaya, wearing the apparel that is synonymous with Middle Eastern attire, how they wear the abayas and everything there. Is that something that should be continuous or considered a norm for observant Muslims, the Salafis, the Abundis who dress in that way, and those who are not, that's somewhere in between or whatever? That's the question I'm looking at. And what I'm saying is not to discard the abaya, but I'm saying, for example, we're looking at that color, the black attire, which has become symbolic with or synonymous with Middle Eastern, Arab-centric practice of the deen. And then we move again to the Muslim male attire. We like to wear the thobe. We know that it's not obligatory that we wear the thobe and you can wear no other dress or whatever. But when wearing the shamah and everything like this, which is, again, synonymous with an Arab-centric perspective, does there need to be a discussion and consideration on the attire that we are wearing, not solely because of what's happening with regards to the non-Muslim societal perspectives that are on us, but what our perspectives and perceptions are of Muslim attire as it relates to the various societies that we are living in. So, for example, I've seen in the most extreme cases, I'm not saying extreme ideology or what, I'm saying dress sense. Some brothers, it's freezing cold, absolutely freezing cold, snow, everything like this. But they will still put on the vest and the flimsy white thobe. I say flimsy not in an insulting way, that really light thobe. And they may wear socks and put on flip-flops or shoes or whatever as they're walking to the masjid. Is this in the spirit or understanding of the context of our deen to be dressing in a way that climate doesn't favor, should I say, or is you're doing that in an adverse climate? So I'm bringing slightly different things here. That's to do with climate, but more to the point that I want to focus is, do we have to have a discussion? Should we have a discussion on our attire, okay, with regards to what image we are presenting and what are we emulating? If we are emulating geographic regions and whatnot, if we come from those regions, that's one thing. We see the Malaysians wear their abayas and everything slightly different, as do the Indonesians, as do the Somalis. So is it time to start having that discussion and having it on the front foot to say, no, we are not adhering to these abaya bans, and we are not behaviorally extreme as you're trying to highlight. However, here is the diversity in how we wear the abaya, or how we wear that outer garment that has been legislated in the Quran, Surah Ahzab, with regard to the woman's attire.
I see, for me, I don't see it as an issue so much as I think that's more of uh, a personal choice. I don't think it's a priority issue for us as a community. In that, if someone wants to wear something, as long as they're identifying as a Muslim and what they're wearing is mashrur, okay, that it's legislated, meaning that the sisters shouldn't be wearing pants, and they shouldn't be wearing jeans, and they shouldn't be wearing spandex and a scarf. That's not hijab. And so as long as it's defined, that it's within the bounds of Islam, then alhamdulillah, it's not an obligation that we have to wear a thobe, and our thobes have to be Yemeni style or Moroccan style or Saudi style, Gulf style or what have you, but rather that what we are wearing is within the bounds. And you'll find that obviously sisters are a greater target in that they can never really truly, if they're practicing their Islam, compromise their dress, so to speak. Like you may see us, like if someone looks at us, they're not at this stage going to know we're necessarily Muslim. Yes, we have our beards. We both have a different attire on, and if we go out, people are not going to know automatically. Oh, you're a Muslim. Compared to the sisters, um, their garb, if you will, identifies them pretty. Uh, there's a strong relationship with Islam. Okay, so I personally don't see a lot of that. If someone wants to, I think it's important to people should know that you're Muslim, that there should be some sort of identity because it's easy for us to flee. And then our women and so forth, they don't have that option. They don't have that option. But, it also depends on the space that they occupy. Are they out in the workforce and so forth, or are they mainly at home and what have you? So I think there's a lot of issues going on there. I think as long as it's mashroor, that it's something legislated and that someone, that the particular culture, us as reverts, we don't have an established Islamic culture, so to speak, with coming to Islam, but rather we usually adopt those people closest to us. When I was a new Muslim, I used to wear some West African clothing, and I used to wear a lot of shalwar kameez. I used to have a wardrobe. I wish I had some now, man. I want to get some, but anyway, um, so I used to wear those in the pinta pajama or whatever you call them. So I used to wear those a lot until I went to Yemen. Because actually, when I went to Yemen, I had that. Then Yemen, I used to wear the izar or the mawas. So we began to take on those. And then in Saudi, there was a time I used to wear even the igal with the shamach. You know, and so I think we have a tendency we adopt those things, and there's no problem. That's the culture, the thing, and I think it's just comes down to what our perception. If we begin to think that that's the only way, or it's superior, and a lot of time that was kind of how we began to kind of think. When I was coming from Yemen, I was beginning, hey, the czar, you got to have a czar and imama, and if I could have my jembia, I would wear one in this society. But um, you kind of sometimes it can lead to, and that's on you as an individual to check that cultural centrism, I guess you might say, or just being thinking that you're better. Oh, you need to wear a thobe. Akhi, why don't you have a thobe? Why don't you have a shamach? You know, so I think that's a personal thing that people need to work on, to not think that one is superior to another. And I think we find our new blended identity, as being Muslims and also being reverts, and and we find our own and carve out our own new space. So for me, that I don't see that as a major issue from our community, but I do see the how to deal with that, especially in a place like France and so forth, where they're under assault from the government. Their issue is more complex and more pressing, because obviously it has implications. You may go to jail, or you're banned from going to school and attending public schools, or all of these things. France is pressing. They're pressing
I
for
acknowledge.
assimilation. Yeah,
I acknowledge what you're saying about,
yeah,
from your perspective, that it's not a pressing issue. But I want to come back on that and push back a little bit on that, because Sister Shireen says, rightly so, that identity is power. And that's at the end of her statement, where she's mentioned there, if Hassan puts it back up shortly, about that before banning the Abaya, they banned hijab. So they're banning identity representation because identity is power. And that's where I'm going to use Shireen's comment to come back a little bit at what you said, while acknowledging what you're saying. Now, when likewise, some of us dressed as the Tarawak did, and some of the brothers were wearing kahal in their eyes, following the Sunnah, but would have the wrap of the Tarawak and the garments of North Africa, Saharan Africa. In adopting these different styles of dress, at the stages we were at, going back to my cognitive framework, the founding stages, or the youthful stages, those abstract understandings, there's a shift in our identities anyway. Okay, and as you said, you wore shawar kameez, some adopted other dresses, and while there's not an issue per se with that, it's indicative of an identity shift of sorts. And when that's happening in society as well, moving away from, as converts particularly, moving away from particular practices, moving towards more religious practices, but there's also that physical change that's taking place with regards to dress and attire, especially the women. From a societal perspective, it could be reviewed or viewed as a vulnerability because of the various levels of shifting and changing, and self-identity is shifting and changing in that particular instance. And I will speak from a point of a convert, revert, where we were actually told from we were being policed and objectified from wider society for years before, going right back to slavery. But then coming into the fold of Islam, we are then being objectified and policed within the parameters of Islam, being told even how to wear our hairstyles. Alhamdulillah, I shave my hair now. No one can say anything about that. But even at the time, shaving my hair, we were being likened to the Khawarij. And we spoke to the ulama, and they said the Khawarij used to shave their hair regularly, but we know you're not doing it in that. And also, any attire that we may have held back from Jahiliyyah, we'd maybe wear a thobe. We were doing that. We were emulating Arab-centric dress, or some of us African-centric dress, and some went Pakistani dress or whatever, which I will say I found very strange with some of our black brothers wearing the shawar kameez and everything like that. I did find that strange, I'll be honest with you, and I'm not shunning it, but then it went from, if we were wearing Nike trainers or Adidas or any of these trainers or footwear that we're used to wearing, we were frowned upon to such an extent that brothers started wearing sandals, okay, to emulate more. So in shifting an identity, okay, are we shifting to a more Islamic religious understanding of that, or are we shifting to a more cultural one? And whatever shift is taking place, if there's a perception from society that that can be challenged, then it will be. And this moves me to the next point on this for you, Khalid. Society wouldn't be able to implement some of these changes if there was more of a solidarity or uniformity in the understanding of Muslims regarding our own attire. And I'm not saying there should be uniforms, but you have progressive liberal Muslims who speak against the abaya, who even speak against the hijab, who speak against the niqab, who speak against the beard. Muslims. And some of these individuals are in positions of power. So they have influence in that dilution of the deen, aspects of dress. And that is often what you'll see legislators, policymakers leaning into in order to make these abaya bans. They use that, well, we've got Muslims who are supporting such a particular stance and particular position. So let's get with this caucus of Muslims, and that emboldens them to make such steps.
No, I think, and if we're maybe a bit more accurate or a bit more exact in looking at that, those people who fit into that that liberalization and secularization, really, they're really one of two types. Either they've already left Islam anyway, even if they, as far as their belief system, and they're going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen, because it doesn't matter. You could pray all day and make Hajj and everything else, but if you're Aqidah, you're shot out now. You don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen. Allah says this, you say, no, 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 no. It's more liberal now. It's more progressive. We got to get rid of that. So there's some of those that, although we maybe, depending on what's outward in their appearance and their what they're saying, we're not rushing to make takfir of them. But bottom line is, there's many who have left the fold of Islam according, they'll say Allah is a her. Why are we being so male dominated? Let's say we need to change that in the Quran to say her, not he. Subhanallah. This shows you the level of ignorance, ignorance and kufr. Okay, so a lot of those you can almost discount, although the policymakers are not discounting them. And then at best, those people are really deviant, misguided people who misguide others at best because of their ignorance. When you're going against a lot, the hijab, things clear in the Quran, clear in Islam, clear in the Sunnah, clear by ijma. Then most of the time the scholars will yahkam ala hada huwa kafir. They will judge that this person khalas is a kafir. Now, if they, whatever their particular ignorance, if they have some excuse for some of these people's ignorance or what have you, regardless, they are not even representative of Muslims in that sense. They are an aberration that has now become like, others who are hostile towards Islam and Islamic belief and Islamic dress and Islamic mores, So they exist. It is a reality, and it's a growing ideology. It's like now it's so widespread, this kind of secularist thing. Well, let's not judge. Only Allah can judge. Let's not command the good and forbid the evil. It's, you don't know what's in their heart, and they're LGBTQ. We should march with them and be proud with them and help them. And they are, and help them in their onslaught. It's okay if two men, I might not choose that, but this mindset, there's a lot of people, their minds and their hearts are gone already. They're gone. So I don't see them as, they're illegitimate. They're illegitimate. If they are going against these basic premises in Islam, I mean, what, as far as from the Islamic perspective, but how we deal with that is something, is a different issue. How do we navigate when the policymakers are making these, do we have the, I guess, political power to be able to kind of push back or our influence through our various means within the society to say, hey, we are not down with these ideologies, or you cannot, under this supposed democratic system, you cannot force us to leave these important tenets of our faith, or, our in our mores and our dress and so forth. So I think, and I don't think we need to compromise. If we look at, there are many successful models we have in America. For example, we have the Amish, we have other communities. They don't care. They don't care what they are very strong. They have their communities. They've carved out their space, and they live very cut off lives without electricity, with everything else, and they control their little society, to a greater or lesser extent. They're like almost autonomous. So I think, not being shy about those things, because the more that we become shy about our identity and we begin to compromise and think so much all the time of what everyone else is thinking, again, we will end up compromising our deen, plain and simple, in so many respects, because it only footballs, or it only, continues to get progressively worse. It doesn't get better when you begin to compromise. It doesn't really get better.
That's
for
right.
you
And I agree with you on that. I think the example of the Amish is always going to be an interesting one, but then we need to look at, does the Muslim populace want such insularity? And they don't. We don't. Maybe amongst the Salafis, and even amongst us, the Salafis, not all Salafis want that element of insularity, especially from the perspective of dawah, being out amongst the people, being out giving the dawah. I think that's very important. Anon has made some very good observations regarding how they're trying to dilute and basically bring the Muslim woman away from Islam, as you've alluded to. I think there's a comment there as well, though, speaking back to the point regarding how we self-identify. Is there a time? Has the time come where we need to reconsider particular aspects and be proactive in that? as it's been said here, we may need alternative Islamic clothing which still fulfills the conditions of the Sharia without being from a particular land or culture from abroad. Wallahu alim. And I think that's a very good statement and a relevant statement that's been made, because we've seen in America, we were seeing garments that were being designed three-quarter jeans and baggy t-shirts, and we saw no matter what the opinion is on that, we saw Muslim women trying to come forward with the burkini, even though that was still banned on the beach, and even though some sisters were like, no, it shows your shape and everything like that. I'm not using that as an example. I'm just citing that there has been that imagination, and is that still required with regards to, as I said, some of the brothers came forward with some very good garments that were more attuned. Even the kufis that used to be worn, I know some brothers I used to buy from graduates from Medina who would make kufis that were from Guyana, but they were more attuned to the attire that we may be wearing, the type of clothes we may be wearing, the casual garments we may be wearing in the West. So is that necessary? But more to the point on that, we in the West have been more reactionary to the changing tides of society than proactive. And while there has been proactivity, there hasn't been a uniformity and a consistency amongst the Muslim communities with that. And this is, again, why I believe there is that weak front to the onslaughts that continually affect us from society, like the ban of the Abaya now in France. How long is that going to be at the helm of front of the media, should I say? Like I started off. When that's no longer being reported in the media, are we still going to have that focus and concentration on what is taking place there? Knowing that it's highly likely it's going to transfer across the waters to the UK or across the other European borders, as we've seen when the niqab ban had taken place. When is that uniformity going to be consistent around key elements of Muslim identity? Education being one of them. And some will come back and say, no, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing A, B, C, D. Was it reactionary or was it proactive? Which one was it? And is it isolated? Because in America, just like in the UK, many communities are working in either silos or in competition with the authorities, funding, stuff like that, with each other. And it's a problem, Khalid. And it's all around identity, self-identifying. And converts, I really do believe, reverts really do have a role to play in this regard. Have we become regressive in academic, professional pursuits? Have we changed our attire to the extent that we're wearing Muslim garb, but the quality and standards we are going for do not reflect how we used to dress before we were Muslims? And you're fine, Khalid, I'm sure you've seen that yourself, that suddenly, okay, I'm more aesthetic and I'm focusing on my inner spiritual aspect. So we basically reduce the standards of our dress, which is in contrast to what the Deen says. We're not told to dress in opulence and everything, but Allah tells us about our adornment. In Surah Araf, Allah speaks very clearly about our attire that we should be wearing. In Surah Araf, with regards to good clothing, and we know that hadith that if Allah bestows you with some wealth or the ability to wear good clothes, you should wear them. But we have regressed, or not even regressed, we have taken piety to mean poverty. Piety does not mean poverty. Poverty and the two don't always equate. So what are we projecting, including the sisters? Is the abaya just an outer garment and we're going out in slippers and woolly socks? because we just that's the understanding we have of this a garment that we're throwing over ourselves. What is the impression that is being given? Yes, the undergarment's not being seen for the Muslim woman, alhamdulillah, but what is the mindset? What is the mindset? Is it growth or is it stagnant? Is it an emulation of the deen, or is it a misapplication of the deen? And that's what we're seeing in some areas, Khalid, regularly, frequently. So how do we self-identify? That's the question. And if we are self-identifying in a much more proactive, progressive, not progressive liberalism way, then it will be harder for government, statutory bodies to try and impose these bans and prohibitions upon our identity, whether it's external identity or internal identity.
No. Heavyweight doctor. One thing, why I see that, I think culture, to go back to one of the points you mentioned, it already manifests itself. We already have carved out our American flavor of dress, just like all the Arab countries, even they all have their own thing. In Syria, yes, they wear those, but there a lot of Syrians also, they have their own things where they've adopted, probably from a legacy of colonialism as well. In a lot of places in Egypt and so forth, they wear pants as well. They'll wear pants, and it's not a thing, and that has become their norm. So I don't think, again, I think those spaces, I think already you see this more, especially from those who are maybe older and in those more mature phases in their, for example, on your growth scale, they're in that they a stage of development, that they already kind of carved out their own space in, and how they dress and what they feel comfortable with, and keeping Islamic, or Islamic as possible, or what have you. um, and again, I think those options aren't the same exactly with regards to the women. They don't have really the same flexibility, so to speak, as far as what they can wear. Although they are doing that. That's plain and simple the way. You go a lot of not, and I would say they're non-religious. Maybe they pray and stuff like this. I'm sure there's some they do pray, but some that matter of fact, even at my job, certain women there, they don't wear hijab at all, and then but they pray, and she'll wear her abaya and everything right there, and prays in her space, and people are walking by and everything, so she prays, but she doesn't wear hijab at all, hair out, everything. So uh I think, you know in the various countries, and with the various cultures, people kind of carve out their own thing. It's kind of inevitable. There's going to be pockets that they have their own way of dress, and you'll find this with a lot of Salafis. But even that is not exactly. If you go to a place like Philly or New Jersey and stuff like this, where there's a lot of Salafis and so forth, and a lot of Muslims in general, you see they have their own flavor and they rock their own way, and that has always been the case. Even when the sisters wore the black abayas and niqab, they had I forgot what those kind of boots that were, the combat boots kind of. Sisters would be mashing in their boots and stuff like that, because it's cold in Jersey, it's cold in New York, it's cold in Philly, in those places. But that they rock their own flavor, and they rock the shoes, and they like to look, and even the hats and stuff like this. So I think there will be that cultural norms and flavor is going to come out anyhow. So that's why I don't see it as big an issue, as long as it's within the conformity of the shutter. It's already something that manifests itself. People are going to have their cultural flavor and norms, and especially, as you said yourself, in your studies, with the in the later developmental stages of growth, of maturity, and kind of being able to reflect, compared to that those early stages of zeal, especially for us as either reverts or people who are newly practicing, because they probably go through a similar,
Mm,
uh, similarity in that you could probably apply that to them as well, in a sense. So I think those cultural norms, it's going to manifest itself. But I think the greater issues for places like France and so forth, and again, for us to be aware, and make dua, but there's very little that we can do except for be conscious in our societies that we live in as Muslim minorities, to watch how things, in which direction things are going, depending who the leadership is and how they're influencing the society. Are they going to go on that same track? Will they be able to, under the guise of some new legislation, be able to enforce those things in America or the UK or Canada or uh, other Western countries, as a Muslim minority? So these are always going to be challenges, I think. And I do believe that it's inevitable that the more you're practicing your Islam, that there's always going to be a tension. I don't think ever there's really the super comfort of being a Muslim minority, because Islam in general, that is not a space, unless you're proactive in teaching Islam and illustrating Islam and stuff like this. You are generally losing and compromising. No, 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 we can't make the adhan outdoors. No, we can't do this. We can't do this. But it's so much bigger than that. Those are just some big symbols which discern a Muslim country. The adhan outwardly and stuff like that, signs of Islam. But there's so many ways, as we see now everywhere. Like we said, we talked about the LGBTQ onslaught, that you see that uh, you're always going to be challenged greatly and assaulted in some ways, as your morality, your way of thinking and belief system, in the society. I think that's inevitable. I don't care how much you try to, as Allah mentions, they will never be pleased with you until you leave
mm.
your deen, basically. I think that is, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions it, it's not going to. Now we are just in a position, we navigate, because these are, for us coming from the West, and many people who migrated or were born here, and their parents, they're not going anywhere. They're here. They're here to stay.
But then,
Probably.
Khalid, let me ask you. So on that, I hear what you're saying in that regard, and yeah, that's understandable. However, I'm going to come back to the collective, because the examples you gave of the different attires that have been worn in Philly and everything, that's good. But if we continue to operate and function with this isolationist approach, that's only going to embolden society to take these steps. And I'm not just talking within our own societies. We've seen what's continuing to take place with the Uyghurs in China. But because that's not at the forefront of the media anymore, it's not being looked at by the Muslims. And I'm speaking about Muslims now. We don't trust media, but yet we are governed by it in what comes to the fore or what disappears from the headlines. The Rohingyas are another set of people. Okay, the Palestinian cause is still being spoken about. But what we saw in China, the stripping of identities, okay, or with regards to hijab, with regards to beards, with regards to the conditioning that is taking place. And because that's remote geographically, it's out of our mind, out of sight, out of mind. This is being looked at state level. When we look at some of the steps that were taken in Nazi Germany with regards to the elimination of minorities, the Jewish populations in themselves, we said that will never happen again, as it shouldn't. But was that restricted to a particular people? And some might say, oh, he's overreaching now in that regard. No, I'm not overreaching. look at what is happening in various quarters of society to Muslim minorities. And it's happening in plain sight of other Muslim communities, either in those societies or in other societies. So there's no comprehensive, sustainable strategy of dawah, first and foremost, of pushing back, challenging the second tier, to ensure that pressure is being maintained across societies on what's being done to Muslim identity. And I'm going to say Muslim identity. With the Jewish faith, especially the Ashkenazi Jews, many had to change their names when in Europe. Many had to change their names when in Europe. Why? That's an identity issue, again, that we're looking at. And we never want to repeat what happened then. But is that just lip service as it relates to the Muslim communities? We're living in the West, the biggest Muslim populace living in the West as a minority ever known since the advent of Islam. And look at the disparate nature and the onslaught that's coming ideologically. We know of Ilhab al-Fikri, Sheikh Ibn Baz. We've mentioned, Rahimahullah mentioned this over 40 years ago. But let's look at what's taking place. So proactivity is required because at state level, let's say it's arguable, but we are seeing ideological attacks. There are elements of state legislated terrorism in some societies, maybe not in others. But remember, state legislated terrorism doesn't mean that physical incarceration, killing. It can be ideological. And ideologically, that battle, yes, we're seeing increases in the amount of conversions, reversions to Islam, but we're also seeing apostasy on scales that we've not seen before. And alhamdulillah, we know we have the assurance of Allah in the deen, in the Quran, of replacing others, and that the deen will be uppermost and foremost. We have that, but that doesn't mean that we sit in a slumber or we sit protecting our particular communal spaces while we're seeing these things taking place. We are speaking to each other, Khalid, and I'm going to stop on this point. We are speaking to each other. The Muslims are speaking to each other about the Abaya ban. We're in echo chambers, speaking to each other. How many are articulating from the basics that they may know of the deen and cascading that resilience, that challenging of these legislations, this legislature which is coming through against Muslim identity? Yes, Brother Bilal, features.
Yeah.
It is an ideological attack.
I
So
think
my thing, I'll let you go, Khalid, but
yeah.
my thing is that we have to call it what it is. And just because it's not brutal with the horns showing, it doesn't mean it's not state legislated. We're seeing it here. And it is a form of attack.
Of course, we already established that. But I think the issue is, you mentioned some things that it's almost completely out of our hands. When you're a Muslim diaspora and you're Muslim minorities divided with whole different issues. Yes, you make dua and you want to think as a Muslim because we're ordered to be one body. We are so different. There is almost nothing I can do for the Uyghurs except for make dua. Perhaps I could write some letters to Congress people, to non-Muslims, to aid and put pressure on China. That's it. The Uyghurs themselves have no power except for to try to practice their Islam or make hijra or physically resist. All of those things are, a lot of those things the end result is death or be assimilated, more or less, be wiped out, their identity. So they are operating in a totally different societal structure. For one, it's a communist society versus a so-called democratic society, where you do have the means institutionally, technically, to be able to resist and fight back. It may not work perfectly, but you can make progression, and you can fight within the system, against the system, and even outside the system. A society like that's not an option. China, you're finished. They'll just disappear you. End of story. So they are forced, and China is a big world power, and they're not really caring what, they don't like their name tarnished, but they're just doing what they want to do to them. So I think the point is, one of the things is, as you mentioned, the media coverage and so forth like this. Of course, it's going to go out of your mind. It's going to you'll forget. You're not every day thinking about the Uyghurs, and then your own community. I didn't even say society. I'm not even talking about, even when I talk about American Muslims, I don't even have to go beyond the boundaries of America. When we have so many vastly different problems as a ummah that are different. Now, there should be some connection, but we operate totally different. Within the past 3 days, the various masajid I went to are so different, and their problems are different. I went to a community yesterday, super, I didn't even, it's a new masjid, new community, very wealthy, small town, uh, you know, beautiful little la-di-da place. Their issues that they're dealing with are totally different compared to Seattle, which is one of the big cities here in Washington State. In Seattle, and even Seattle is going to be divided north and south. The south end and those places, we're dealing with Muslim youth and gangs. We're dealing with killings every week. It has just changed so much. We're dealing with also the progressive onslaught as well through all Washington State, as well as the rest, but especially in Seattle is like second to San Francisco. And we're dealing with every kind of onslaught. So as on the micro level, it's it's hard to always be in tune. You have to deal with things on the ground with what is going on in your community. So you make dua, you try to look at this, but the bottom line is we're so fragmented, and this is also a negative of being a Muslim minority, plain and simple. Those are extra trials and tribulations because you're disconnected. You don't have Muslim leadership really. You are disconnected from the Sharia mostly. There's many issues. It's not like living in Saudi Arabia or Yemen and all, and they have their own issues and problems that they deal with. So we don't have unified Islamic leadership on the world level, really.
Mhm.
So how is it as a Muslim minority? Of course, I'm not going to be waking up in the morning after Fajr and say, waking up at Fajr and praying and necessarily maybe I'll make dua for the Uyghurs, but there's so many other things. Nobody's talking about what's going on in Africa, the Central African Republic. We deal with so much inner racism between our communities. Somebody asked me the other day, they said, so would you ever like to live in Somalia? I said, honestly, no. I mean, I don't see myself there, but I just said I'm very close with the Somali communities and stuff around the world, and they're very racist. I wouldn't feel that comfortable there. That wouldn't be so good for me. I'd rather be in Yemen, which is actually an Arab, but certain parts of Yemen, or Indonesia. I found also good there. And, different people have different traits. The point is we all have our own, uh, it's easy for us to be disconnected. It's very easy for us to be disconnected. And there's very little, if we can't even change we can't even deal with the gun violence here in Seattle, Washington, which is different than what's going on in LA. That's just California, a state away, state or two away, or what's going on in Oregon, or what's going on in New Mexico, or then you go to Philly or Chicago and the gang violence and the craziness, they go there. We're so disconnected. What goes on in Philly doesn't really have
But
much
Khalid,
to
that's
do
part
with
of the
me.
problem. That
Well, I'm
because
saying, but how in the world are you going to have? I mean, how? I mean, it only comes through, you need unified leadership,
right.
and you need to be able to have we're so far from that, because we can't even on the micro level. have these connects, aside from all of our sectarian differences, but also even racial differences, racial politics. People are not going to, they don't
Yeah,
care.
but that,
I can
Khalid, I
navigate with
understand.
all these communities. They do not, I will never be on the board of director of all, even all the communities we hear in our Somali communities, Oromo, then we have Amhara, then
Yeah,
we
but
have,
okay, Khalid, I get what you're saying there, but
yeah,
the standpoint can no longer be that, because it's been that for so long. We've heard. I acknowledge what you're saying. I hear you. I was at the helm of a community for over 15 years. I know what you're speaking about. But one of the things that we need to be doing, we know the hadith, and I know you know it better than I do, that when one part of the body is aching, the rest of the body is aching. That's almost not there now. It's more, we act as though one part of that body has been decapitated, or limbs have been cut off, when they haven't, or they're so numb or gangrene, okay, that we're not even feeling them, and we're okay with that. Well, that right hand is gangrene, so just leave it. Let's focus on what's in front of me. Oh, my left finger, my left thumb, sorry, is in front. If we continue with that, looking navel gazing effectively, I'm not saying that you're saying that, but if we're navel gazing on a microcosmic level that many communities are doing, then we will continue to be in the position that we're in, seeing the infringement upon our rights. And yes, we are a minority in the West, but we are a significant minority that can make headway and has made headway previously. But we do need to join the dots. We do need to come with strategies where there are common things where we can say, right, education is one. What's happening with our children? Everyone, irrespective of denomination, needs to come together. Cooperation with Bear and Taqwa, as we know, the ayat that is there, the explanation and understanding of that. It's not the coming together with righteousness and Bear and Taqwa with your own group or entity. That's one really narrow understanding of that. But we're talking the Muslim collective around a common and societal collective in some instances on common issues of security, safety, things that advance the faith or the well-being of us as human beings. It's a long discussion, Khalid, but what I want to do, I think it's a good point to conclude with the question that was asked. If Hassan, if you can put that question up about what is the prophetic example that deals with what we're looking at in France at the moment. So which example of the prophetic seerah can we see? And I would say in the first instance, and maybe you can elaborate upon that, Khalid, in instances that from the seerah, but we saw the first hijrah that was ordered by the Prophet ﷺ to Abyssinia due to the persecution. Some Muslims stayed in Makkah, others did hijrah to another society that wasn't Muslim but had a religious leader there who was understanding. That is an amazing story and still an example for us today. Only a week ago, the group that I was in with some brothers, Sheikh Abu Salman's in that, and another student of knowledge, were talking about what have the ulama said concerning the situation with France, because it's only getting worse. So hijrah would be the first option in that respect. But Khalid, those who are remaining and cannot do hijrah, is there anything that comes to mind with how they should be? I'm thinking of the time of the famine and the boycott that happened to the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba in Makkah, but I don't know whether, I don't think I'm qualified enough to extrapolate and put a parallel with that in any shape or form. So I will stick with the first perspective of hijrah if possible.
no. Yeah, I think as you said, hijrah if possible. And that's something we've been mentioning throughout our series about that importance of and the reality of the situation of being a Muslim minority in the West. But again, and we've talked about this before, that basically, if you're not, get in where you fit in. That's what we say. Get in where you fit in. So meaning that those people who stay behind, that they need to practice their Islam. You need to practice. You need to set your example. This is why the scholars would be asked, like in the time of Ibn Uthaymeen and others, what about going to the West? Going and being a da'i and stuff like that. So yeah, if you can safeguard your deen, under these conditions, you're going and give dawah. So if you are there, you need to, in order to maintain your identity and maintain your children's identity as Muslims, you need to practice your Islam, plain and simple. That's an obligation on us all the time, regardless of the situation or not. We need to practice our Islam. And the problem is we've gotten so far away from our Islam, most of us, that we're not that Muslim identity. We can have whole areas where lots of Muslims live, but the Muslim women are saying, "Hey, I don't have children. It's her ninth baby. She wants more welfare from the system. I don't know where the husband is, so she can get another check." This has become common practice amongst many of the Muslim communities, so much so that I recall someone saying years ago about I think this is in Philly or someplace. They say, "Oh, here comes another Muslim," very bad word for a woman, because she was wearing niqab. Why? Because it was so common that the hijabis would come and lie to get benefits from the system.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're not practicing our Islam, I mean, that's the most rudimentary thing, but it's honestly, that's the only way you're going to get the help from Allah. And that's for myself and then those who are listening. That practicing and representing your Islam is the only success, because we can try every secular solution. Oh, this worked for these guys, it worked for these guys, it worked for but it's not successful ultimately as a Muslim, because you got to be successful with Allah and you need the help and assistance of Allah. Otherwise, yeah, you could be successful, you could start a community and be a very wealthy millionaire, not caring whether your earnings are halal or haram. Your name is Fatih and you live in the suburbs somewhere, and your neighbors are all nice and like Leave It to Beaver, and you don't care about anything. You don't go to a masjid, you don't pray, you don't care. You just want your children to be educated and go to Harvard. This is the case for there's a lot of people like that on the wealthier end. Then you have those who are in the struggle, and not so much like that. But the bottom line is having those, it's your Islam, it's your community, it's keeping those things. And that is what needs to happen for those who stay behind in the West, that you need to have some sort of, hopefully, imprint on the greater society, at least, or at least preserving your deen by being away. If you choose to be totally insular, like we said, the Amish model, which we have communities like that. I'm actually somewhat part of one, that where we have Muslim families that live in a locality and no one, far away from everyone. We do interact with the other society, but the point is it's about, you need to practice your deen. If you are going to stay in a situation where you are a Muslim minority and you can still practice some of the basics of your deen, then you need to make sure you're practicing that and setting that example and doing the dawah to the best of your ability. Otherwise, not only will you be in sin, but you may lose your deen and you'll lose your children.
Jazakallah khair, Khalid. I think this has been quite comprehensive. I think it's a discussion that can go on and on, looking at what's taking place. I think the focus on France and what's happening there is a lesson that should be learned and observed for us in the societies we live, be it the UK, be it America, because while it's happening over there, we should not be lulled into a false sense of security or an illusion that it will not happen with us. I'll read Brother Bilal, the features comments here. Muslims in general have this confounded idea that somehow Western societies are concerned about justice. The French are colonizers like any other colonizer. Yes, and as you mentioned earlier, they're losing ground, as we're seeing in Niger, and we're seeing that that's going to be a momentum that continues in and across Africa. But that doesn't mean that the former colonial powers are going to go away easily. It's been a good session, as always, Khalid. I thank the brothers and sisters for their participation, and any non-Muslim guests who are here. I hope there's been benefit there. Wa yakum to you for that, and Shireen, jazakallah khair to you as well for your input. Brothers and sisters, we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks, in a fortnight, inshallah. This has been the Doctor's Lab, surgically, academically dissecting elements as we can from our perspectives and from our studies. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.